4 years ago this week, Euromaidan Revolution of Dignity happened. It doesn't seem like 4 years, it seems like probably 10 years at least, because of so much that's happened in those 4 years, not only revolution and domestic developments in Ukraine, but of course Russia's annexation of the Crimea and continued military aggression against eastern Ukraine, international sanctions, new Cold War, you name it, it's been happening in the last 4 years. It's a very intense and packed-in period of history. So it'd be good to kind of review the positives and negatives of what's happened in the last 4 years, particularly ahead of the March 2019 presidential elections and then the October 2019 parliamentary. So the presidential elections are only, what, now 6 months, 5 months to go. But, you know, I'm on a number of different Ukrainian diaspora discussion forums, and they seem to ignore what happened during the Brexit referendum and during the US 2016 elections. We should ignore opinion polls at this stage in the election campaign. If anything has taught us about Brexit and the US elections is that we don't know who's going to win till literally a few days or even on the last day of the election. Nobody believed Trump was going to win. Nobody believed Brexit was going to win the referendum. So the idea that somehow an opinion poll in November, 5 months before election day, is going to give us an insight into who's going to win Ukraine's elections is completely hocus pocus. It's just not going to happen. So bearing in mind, what has been the, shall we say, let's do the positive first. Everybody, I once wrote a few months ago actually that Ukrainians are masochists. They love beating up upon themselves. Maybe that's because the Austrian Count, Mr. Masok, was actually born in Lviv, then Lemberg. Russians don't seem to do that, but Ukrainians love to beat up on their political leaders and kind of, as my mother-in-law would say, oy oy oy, sina mene, heina mene. So what, you know, the thing we should take into account is that we should compare post-Euromaidan with post-Orange Revolution. When we do it like that, we can see that these are two different eras completely. I mean, it was so frustrating and depressing covering the Yuschenko era, where you just literally had Yanukovych floating in the sidelines whilst Tymoshenko and Yuschenko fought it out in the public domain, leading to, of course, Yanukovych's counter-revolution coming back to power in 2010. Nothing was really done. Ukrainians were very disillusioned, and so much so that many of them in 2010 actually believed and supported Yushchenko's idea that protiv всіх, they're both as bad as each other, Tymoshenko and Yanukovych. Compared to that, after the Euromaidan, a huge amount has been done. So, you know, if under Yushchenko, the glass was either it wasn't even half full or half empty, it was just empty, or it had been stolen. At least under Poroshenko, we can say some would say it's half full, some would say it's half empty. You know, there hasn't been enough done, or there's been already a lot done. At least you can debate that. But under Yushchenko, there was literally very little, if anything, was being done. What kind of positive things have happened? Let's look at the domestic domain. Well, you've had yes, there's been some backsliding, but you've had quite a lot of progress on a whole range of reforms, economic, social, financial, and particularly in the energy sector. These were, in many ways, Ukraine long overdue. Ukraine had to do them because that was the only way it would get IMF financial assistance in 2014, when Ukraine was nearly bankrupted by Yanukovych's mafia regime. What's important is to look at not just, when we tend to look at fighting corruption, we tend to look at only one aspect of that, which is how many people have gone to jail. Well, there's more to it than simply that. Firstly, Ukraine's created quite a large number of new institutions to fight corruption. Now, yes, they're having, kind of problems in maybe getting adjusted to real life, getting adjusted to working properly. That's always going to be the case with new institutions. But at the same time, these institutions have been created, they're not going to be dismantled, and they are going to eventually produce results. That's very important. And there's quite a lot of them. Wired magazine, a very big magazine for computer geeks, described Ukraine's POZORO system, which is a new online system for government to apply for government contracts, which makes it less corrupt because it's all transparent, and described it as one of the best in the world. Even so, to the degree that many European countries don't have that kind of openness and transparency in awarding of government contracts. The other area where there's been progress in corruption fighting is in closing lots of loopholes. And a very big think tank in Kyiv, headed by Ihor Kolomoyskyi, published a report recently on this and talked about savings at a conservative minimum of $6 billion a year that otherwise previously would have been stolen. Which kind of areas have been closed to corruption? Well, for example, the banking system is now about a half of what the size it was prior to 2014, and that's because many of the banks were they were not banks, they were just institutions to launder money. So, and the biggest one of those was Ihor Kolomoyskyi's Privat Bank, which laundered something like $5.5 billion over 10 years. It was closed down in 2016. And that's the reason why Kolomoyskyi is a very angry man today, very anti-Poroshenko, and why he's financially supporting Yulia Tymoshenko's election campaign. Other areas, VAT refunds, the energy sector. Naftogaz Ukraine, the state gas company, used to eat up anything between 3 to 5% of Ukraine's GDP government budget, sorry. Today, it's the biggest financial contributor to Ukraine's budget. It no longer is a cash cow for corrupt presidents. So there are many areas which previously elites would put their fingers in and put their troughs, as it were, and steal, and that's no longer the case. Now, of course, the third area which has been disappointing is the whole question of putting people in jail, making elites accountable to the law. The problem with that has been because of the corrupt judicial system, hence the reason for the creation of the Anti-Corruption Court, which was established a few months ago and will become up and running in 2019. So whoever gets elected next year will have to produce results with the Anti-Corruption Court. That means putting people in jail. There were no more excuses available from next year. The Anti-Corruption Court is being established as we speak with various judges, international experts, and such like, and that will have to bring results next year. Whoever is elected, whether it's Poroshenko, Tymoshenko, or Gritsenko, most likely. So in the economic, financial, energy areas, there's been a lot of progress. Now, some of that, of course, is not very popular, such as increasing household utility prices, because previously the government was basically using subsidies to keep so that the households wouldn't pay the full price of what gas costs to be imported. Increasing utility prices is not popular anywhere, including in Canada or Britain. So not surprisingly, that has been unpopular for Poroshenko, and of course it's something being used by Tymoshenko to attack the IMF. So Tymoshenko claims she's pro-EU, pro-NATO. You can't be pro-Russian in Ukraine today. It's very difficult to be pro-Russian, not surprisingly. So you have to be pro-Western. But Tymoshenko's lying when she can say she's anti-IMF and pro-EU, because there's no difference between them. The EU Canadian, American, British governments only give financial assistance to Ukraine after Ukraine's adopted and agreed an agreement with the IMF. So the idea that you can somehow be anti-IMF and pro-EU is ridiculous. This is something you would learn in the first year of university. It's not possible. So she's trying to delude through populism her voters because, of course, utility prices, increasing them is not a popular thing to do, especially on the eve of elections. Another area which has been, I think, seen a lot of progress is on the nationality question, on nation building, shall we say. This is probably one of the strongest times for supporting Ukrainian language that we've seen since 1991. The previous time wasn't Yuschenko era, which everybody seems to think it was, but it was actually under President Kuchma. So Poroshenko has followed in that track, and a new draft law in front of Parliament promotes Ukrainian language even more. Ukraine has adopted some of the type of requirements and quotas that, for example, Quebec has over how much of TV and radio should be in the Ukrainian language, in Quebec in French, of course. So that's been very important. You also have tremendous progress in terms of getting rid of the Soviet past. And that's been done in two ways, getting rid of the Soviet and communist past. Two ways. First of all, in 2015, 4 decommunization laws were adopted, which has led to the removal of every single Lenin monument in Ukraine now. When Ukraine became independent in 1991, there were about over 5,000 monuments of Lenin in Ukraine. Proportionally, that was even higher than in Russia. And Russia, which is 3 times the population, it had 7,000. Ukraine had 5. Of course, this has gone in waves. So in Western Ukraine, these were gotten rid of back in the 90s. In central Ukraine, it was a more slower process, but it happened very quickly during the Euromaidan, central Ukraine. And in the first one being, if we remember now, in December 2013, when Svoboda pulled it down. But then it spread to eastern Ukraine. And so think of eastern Ukraine as now decommunized, de-Sovietized. This is on top of changing the names of streets, changing the names of towns, villages, rayon centers. So you've had a massive wave of doing that, very much linked to another successful area of reform, decentralization, which nobody talks about because it's quite a dull topic. It's quite a specialized topic. But Ukraine was long overdue decentralization. It was too centralized. And that has led to the creation of bigger local communities. Much more money is being kept at the local level to use for schools, hospitals, and such like, as opposed to being sent to Kiev. And that means local communities can decide the new names of their villages, towns, and such like, which no longer link to the communist past or the Soviet past. So that's very important for, shall we say, spiritually independence from the Soviet past. But a second step of spiritual independence is religion. There's no question that the granting of autocephaly to Ukraine, Orthodox independence from the Russian Orthodox Church, is one of Poroshenko's greatest achievements. I've compared this to 1991, the disintegration of the USSR, and I don't think that's an exaggeration. If you think of back in 1991, and it just feel like a long time ago, the USSR, the new structure that Gorbachev wanted to create to replace the USSR could not happen because Ukraine said no, because Kravchuk said no. He said, we've had a referendum on independence, we're going for a full blast for independence. So the USSR couldn't really continue to exist without Ukraine, because Ukraine was the second largest and second most populous republic. And it's the same now, except now it's called the Russian world, the Ruski Mir. The Ruski Mir for Putin, which it was created about a decade ago, and the whole point is that we're going to recreate something akin to Kyiv-Rus, with Kyiv as a spiritual center. For Putin, Ukraine is a Russian state. The Ukrainians are Russians. There are no Ukrainians. And Kyiv is where Russians were born. This is what Putin says. 2 years ago, he put up a monument to Volodymyr the Great in Moscow, which was ludicrous because Moscow didn't exist when Volodymyr the Great ruled Kyiv-Rus. So Ukraine withdrawing from that Ruski Mir, and the Ruski Mir is founded not only on this mythological Russian history, but also on the Russian Orthodox Church, which is basically the same as in the Soviet Union. It's just an arm of the Putin regime. Ukraine achieves its spiritual independence from Russia. And as of this month, according to the Constantinople Patriarch, there is no Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. It's been removed, basically. So the decision was made by Constantinople. That will not change. The next step is to have a unification sobor, a unification congress, as it were, of bishops from the three Orthodox churches in Ukraine, the Russian Orthodox Church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Kiev Patriarch, and the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church coming together to create a new Autocephalous Orthodox Church. And then Patriarch of Constantinople will issue a tomos, basically blessing that. And that is very likely to happen before the March elections. Certainly, it would be in Poroshenko's interest, of course, for that to happen, but we already can see cracks in the Russian Orthodox Church. Remember that the reason there's going to be cracks is that a majority of the parishes of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine are actually in Orange Ukraine. They're not in Eastern Ukraine. Everybody thinks of, that one of the biggest myths about Ukraine is that the East is Orthodox and the West is Catholic, which is complete rubbish. In fact, most of the Orthodox parishes are in central and western Ukraine. Places like Zakarpattia, Chernivtsi, Volyn, and in central Ukraine have lots of Russian Orthodox Church parishes. So these are patriotic Ukrainians who are, waiting for the legal steps to be taken to become an autocephalous independent church. So the idea there's going to be some kind of civil war between East and West is not going to happen, especially because of the geographic location. When you drive around the Donbass, as I did in my research, you do not see many churches and villages in the Donbass. This is a Sovietized area. And plus, it's a very urbanized area, so you don't see many villages, in fact. So southern Ukraine, you get some of these Russian Orthodox churches, but the main base is western central Ukraine. So hence, I think autocephaly will not be necessarily a problem. The one sticking point is who will head this new church. As always, everybody wants to be the new hetman, and not everybody wants to have Patriarch Filaret as the new head. But that, taken together, decommunization, desovietization, and the creation of an autocephalous Orthodox Church is basically a second wind to Ukraine becoming independent of Russia and the Soviet past. It happened in '91, now it's happening again. And that should not be underestimated. Coupled on top of that, the tremendous changes in Ukrainian identity brought about by Russia's military aggression against Ukraine, which had the biggest impact of that has been on Russian speakers. You didn't have to convince Halichani or West Ukrainians about Russians, about Russian character. The illusions about Russia, about Russians as our so-called brothers, was illusions held by East Ukrainians, and those have gone, thankfully. They're no longer our brothers. You also have, I think, another link to this. You have the collapse of Russian soft power in Ukraine. I mean, Russia did have lots of leverages up until 2014 in Ukraine, including in mutual corruption in the energy sector, which meant that Ukrainian elites were interlinked with corrupt Russian elites. That's completely gone. Ukraine no longer imports gas from Russia for the last 2 years now, so the ability to have that kind of compromising materials on corrupt Ukrainian elites is no longer the case. But very importantly, Russia's lost its leverages in areas such as Russian TV is no longer broadcast to Ukraine. Russian books, many of them have been banned from being imported because they glorify Russian imperialism. Russian social media like VKontakte, the equivalent of Facebook in the former USSR, has been banned. Yandex, So what you see, ironically, is everybody starting to now use Google and Gmail, whereas before many people still used Yandex as opposed to Google, and they used this horrible Russian email address called .ru. And if you add to that, as it were, the icing on the cake is the Russian Orthodox Church losing its influence in Ukraine, you can see to what degree Putin must be a very frustrated and angry man today, because he doesn't really have the leverages he used to have in Ukraine. One of the biggest areas that he himself has removed as a leverage over Ukraine is the fact that pro-Russian forces can no longer come to power in Ukraine. And the reason for that is that 16% of voters in Ukraine, who in 2010 and 2012 voted for Yanukovych or the Party of Regions or the Communist Party, now live under Russian occupation in the Donbass or the Crimea. I just saw a very good article by talking about this, analyzing this by Paul Danieri, and he calculates that if in 2010 these areas were already under Russian occupation, Tymoshenko would have won those elections by a 10% margin. So that goes to show you the degree to which the removal of 16% of Ukraine's voters under Russian occupation and 27 election districts. The Ukrainian parliament has 450 seats, but only 423 are filled, 27 are in Russian-occupied areas, means that pro-Russian forces have been hampered from coming to power by Putin's military aggression. How's that for irony in the case of Ukraine? So the Ukrainian presidential elections next year will not be the traditional, in the second round, pro-Russian versus pro-Western. That won't happen. What it's going to be is more likely to be Tymoshenko, Poroshenko, Gritsenko, something like that. Probably Poroshenko campaigning on his four or 5 years of activities and policies and results, and versus more likely somebody like a populist like Tymoshenko. It's not going to be Boyko or Rabinovich because they simply don't have the votes anymore to get to the second round. And also, they're too tarnished by Russia's military aggression and by the fact that Viktor Medvedchuk is standing behind them. And Viktor Medvedchuk he's Putin's man in Ukraine. His daughter, the godfather of Medvedchuk's daughter, is Putin himself. And so anybody linked to Medvedchuk is not likely to get many votes. The final area which I think we can say has been quite positive is the area of national security. Ukraine today has the best army it's ever had, literally in the last 100 years. It's ranked about 30th in the world now in terms of its strength and abilities. It's sort of similar in ranking to Canada and Poland, which, you think about it, they're about the same size population countries. And yet, Canada and Poland, spend less on the military, particularly Canada, and those two countries are members of NATO. Ukraine is not. Ukraine spends more on its defense, 5% of GDP, than any country in NATO except the United States. So Putin today would not be able to do what he did in 2014. Ukrainian army is way too strong for Putin to do a big invasion of Ukraine today. If Putin could not achieve his strategic goals in 2014, he certainly wouldn't be able to achieve them today. The other area, which I think two areas which I think are positive in the sort of national security domain, are that sanctions continue, both by Europe, United States, and Canada against Russia, and those sanctions keep getting ratcheted up, partly because of Russia's own home goals, like the attempted chemical poisoning of Sergei Skripal in England, but it's not likely that those sanctions will go away soon. The United States and Canada have issued declarations on the Crimea, which say categorically that those sanctions will remain in place as long as the Crimea continues to be occupied. And finally, and it's very important for Ukraine, of course, the US-Ukrainian strategic partnership is now alive and running, and it's in very good shape. There was, of course, a lot of worry and concern when Trump was elected. There were cries of sorrow in Kiev, and there were champagne corks being opened in Moscow, and that's now it's flipped completely. They're very sad about Trump in Moscow and quite happy with Trump in Kiev. Trump has, for example, agreed to the sending of military equipment to Ukraine, which Obama vetoed. So ironically, if you talk to Ukrainian journalists and Ukrainian politicians, they prefer Trump to Obama. Because they felt Obama was very weak, and they felt Obama betrayed Ukraine in 2014 on the question of security assurances under the Budapest Memorandum. So I think in the areas of reforms, even to some degree in fighting corruption, in terms of spiritual independence, decommunization, Orthodox Church, Russian soft power, and national security, I think quite a lot has been done in the last 4 years. Could more have been done? Possibly, most certainly. The two areas which I think people will continue to pick on is one I've alluded to already, is the lack of criminal convictions. I think that's a disgrace that, for example, people from the Yanukovych team really haven't been put in jail. And you can blame that on the corrupt judicial system, but certainly on the very corrupt General Prosecutor's Office. But that is something that will, I think, work against Poroshenko's re-election. It will work against him. And I think on the more academic level, people talk about that the actual system, the way things are done in Ukraine, hasn't changed that much. The power and influence of oligarchs has declined for all sorts of reasons. Kolomoyskyi is in exile in Switzerland because Poroshenko not only nationalized Privat Bank, which he owned, but also has taken him out in other areas. Akhmetov, of course, has lost a lot of his assets because of the war in Donbass. The gas lobby is no longer able to cream off huge amounts of profits from the corrupt gas trade between Russia and Ukraine, because Ukraine no longer imports gas from Russia. So the oligarchs are not as powerful as they used to be, but what Ukrainians and Russians call the systema, the way things are done, particularly these backroom informal deals, are still in place. Now, you could argue back, and I do that by being half Italian, this is no different to what you get in Southern Europe. I mean, I don't think you have complete transparency and openness in Italy, Greece, Spain. It's a very different way of doing economics, business, and politics than it is in Anglo-Saxon Northern Europe and in North America. So, if the system of informal politics and informal business continues to be the case in Italy, which is a founding member of the EU, then why should we expect things to change so quickly in Ukraine? But certainly that's one area which is something that people talk about. Now, Ukrainians will complain about corruption all the time, and they'll always point their finger at who is corrupt. But of course, what that ignores is the fact that huge numbers of Ukrainians are involved themselves in corruption. For example, in getting their salaries paid in cash, in brown envelopes, or the very large shadow economy. So, when we talk about corruption in Ukraine, we should talk about it in three areas. Yes, but we only tend to talk about it in one area, which is the senior top-level corruption. There is also a large amount of low-level corruption in Ukraine. Shadow economy, people getting paid in brown envelopes, as I mentioned. But there's also a third area, which is Western enablers of corruption. Many countries in Western Europe, or members of the EU, Latvia, Britain, and Cyprus, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, Austria, all help corrupt individuals from Ukraine, Russia, and elsewhere in that region to launder their money, to bring their money to the West. There's a very good new book out by Oliver Bullough, all dealing with that question. And for example, he makes a very good point, which I'll end on, is that Transparency International, the anti-corruption watchdog, always gives Ukraine a very low ranking for fighting corruption. At the same time, it gives Western countries, Western European countries like Britain, very good rankings. But then he argues then, well, why is that? If the money is stolen in a place like Ukraine, Russia, and then it's exported to a place like London where it's used to buy property or other services, then why should only one side of that corrupt equation get blamed by Transparency International? In fact, the impact should be on both sides in terms of their rankings. So the corruption problem is something that will continue to be an important issue, but Ukrainians should stop pointing the fingers at other people and start doing something themselves about their own maybe involvement. So on balance, I think that post-Euromaidan is simply chalk and cheese different to post-Orange Revolution. A lot of different things have been done, and the steps have been done. If the elections go well next year, the next round of elections will be in 2024. Ukraine will be a very different country. It will be far more integrated into Europe and far more distant from Russia and the Soviet past. I can't think of a better present for Putin when he finishes his current term in office in 2024. Thank you.